When we think of the space race, we almost always think of the moon. But while America was totally focused on getting there, the Soviet Union was aiming for our other next-door neighbor, Venus. They launched this incredible series of missions to see what was under those clouds, and what they discovered was an absolute nightmare. And that right there is the big question, isn't it? The one nation that explored Venus more than anyone else just stopped. So to figure out why, we've got to rewind the clock and follow their journey right from the very beginning. All right, let's get into it. The time is the 1960s and 70s. The space race is in full swing. And while the US was pouring every last dollar into the Apollo moonshot, the Soviets were looking for their own massive win. Their target? Well, it was arguably way more ambitious. The completely mysterious cloud-covered planet Venus. See, back then, the big theory was that Venus could actually be Earth's twin. I mean, it's about the same size, it's right next door, who knows what's there? The Soviets thought, hey, anyone can look up and see the moon, but being the first to see what's under those clouds on Venus, now that would be a scientific victory. They were dreaming of finding oceans, maybe even jungles. So this huge ambition kicked off what they called the Venera program. But there was a catch. Soviet policy at the time was, well, you don't talk about your failures. So when things went wrong, and oh boy, did they go wrong, the missions just weren't announced. They vanished from the record. Historians now call them the ghost missions. And those early days were just brutal. It was a completely silent string of failures. Just imagine it. Their very first shot, in February '61, doesn't even make it out of Earth's orbit. A few days later, they launch Venera 1, total radio silence after just 1 week. They spend 4 more years, launch Venera 2, and same exact thing happens. The message from space was pretty clear. Venus was not going to make this easy. And then they had this, well, I guess you could call it a breakthrough, but a pretty grim one. Venera 3 was basically a suicide mission. It was designed just to hit the planet, and it did. It became the very first man-made thing to touch the surface of another world. But its systems fried on the way in, so it sent absolutely nothing back. Just a silent, historic crash. Now, up to this point, the Soviets were flying totally blind. They had no idea what they were getting into. That all changed with Venera 4. It actually made it into the atmosphere, and then it was immediately crushed like an empty soda can. The mission failed, but that failure gave them their first terrifying clue. The pressure on Venus was something else entirely. So having learned a very, very hard lesson, the Soviets went back to the drawing board. For Venera 7, they built a tank. Seriously. The thing was ridiculously over-engineered. They threw out a bunch of scientific instruments just to make it tougher. It had one single mission: survive the landing no matter what. And that landing, wow, it was pure chaos. The parachute ripped during descent, so it slammed into the ground at almost 40 miles an hour. It bounced and tumbled onto its side, with its main antenna pointing completely away from Earth. For all intents and purposes, it was a wreck, it was dead. But then, against all odds, a tiny, faint signal started to trickle in. For 23 agonizing minutes, it was talking to them. So what did that miraculous little signal tell them? Well, first, the temperature. A jaw-dropping 465 degrees Celsius. To put that in perspective, that is literally hot enough to melt lead. It's more than double the heat of your oven cranked up as high as it will go. And second, the pressure. That temperature reading confirms their worst fears. The atmosphere was 90 times thicker than Earth's. That is the same bone-crushing pressure you would feel if you were a kilometer deep in the ocean. Just unbelievable. And this part is just genius. Even with a busted probe, they were still getting data. As the lander fell, the scientists on Earth noticed this tiny shift in its radio signal, the Doppler effect. And just from that little detail, they were able to calculate that the probe was being ripped apart by constant hurricane-force winds screaming at 360 kilometers per hour. Okay, so now they knew Venus wasn't Earth's twin, it was a full-on hellscape. So the next challenge for the Soviet engineers was somehow even harder. How in the world do you see and hear a place like that? And you know what? They actually did it. In 1975, Venera 9 sent back the first picture ever taken from the surface of another planet. And it wasn't some sci-fi jungle or a sandy desert. It was this terrifying alien vista of sharp, shattered volcanic rock stretching out to the horizon. But even this incredible success came with this almost comical level of frustration. See, the landers had two cameras for full panorama. On Venera 9 and its successor, Venera 10, only one of the two lens caps popped off. Okay, bad luck. But then on Venera 11 and 12, which survived for almost 2 hours, both lens caps failed to open. Nothing. Millions of dollars spent for 0 pictures. You just can't make this stuff up. But they didn't give up. They kept pushing. And Venera 13 not only sent back the first incredible full-color images of Venus, it did something even more amazing. It had a microphone. For the first time in human history, we heard the actual sounds of another world, the howl of the Venusian wind, and the faint crackle of distant thunder. But that lens cap curse, it wasn't done yet. This is my favorite part. Venera 14 had this spring-loaded arm that was supposed to pop out and test how hard the ground was. Well, guess what? Its camera ejected right in front of it. Yep, the lens cap. So this multi-million-dollar scientific instrument popped out and measured the hardness of its own lens cap. So, after all the drama, all the near misses, and just the sheer bad luck on the surface, the Soviet strategy had to change. They realized that to really understand this planet that they'd sacrificed so much for, they needed to see the whole picture. It was time to map the inferno from the safety of orbit. So Venera 15 and 16 were different. They were orbiters. And since no camera on Earth could see through those thick acid clouds, they used powerful radar to literally pierce the veil. For 8 long months, they scanned the surface piece by piece and created the very first complete map of Venus, showing these giant mountains and massive cracks that no one knew were there. And this right here brings us to the final verdict. This is the answer to our big question. Why does no one go back to Venus? Because the Venera missions proved beyond any doubt what it's like. The heat melts electronics and metal. The pressure flattens a probe instantly. The atmosphere is made of sulfuric acid that dissolves equipment. The winds are a never-ending hurricane. And if you somehow survive all that, the ground is a minefield of sharp volcanic rock. What they accomplished was just an unbelievable feat of engineering and pure grit against literally impossible conditions. The effort was so massive, so focused, and so successful at revealing the planet's nature that to this day, people in the space community still call Venus the Soviet planet. They are the ones who showed us this hellscape. So in the end, what's the big takeaway? The Soviets, through incredible effort, unimaginable cost, and a whole lot of heartbreak, showed the world that our closest neighbor is a vision of hell. It leaves us with one heck of a question. Knowing what we know now, who would ever dare to go back?